Hello, and welcome to Decision NYC with Ben Max. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. The 2021 New York City election season is well underway, and it's poised to be the most significant municipal election in decades. All of city government is on the ballot this year, and because so few incumbents are eligible to run for their current seats due to term limits, New Yorkers are electing many new office holders and the next roster of leadership for our city. There will be a new mayor of New York City elected here in 2021, as well as a new city controller, several new borough presidents, many new city council members, and that's not all. There are incumbents eligible for and seeking re-election, including the New York City Public Advocate, and there's a very crowded and competitive race for Manhattan District Attorney, and still more. Party primaries are set for June, and the general election will culminate on November 2nd. This is the first full set of municipal elections that will feature both early voting and a new ranked choice voting system, which applies only to party primaries and special elections. And we'll have a separate show to discuss ranked choice voting in detail. This city election cycle would be of enormous importance under more usual circumstances, but it's unfolding at a time of great crisis for our city, raising the stakes of the decisions that you, the voter, will make. The new wave of city leadership will, quite clearly, make or break the city's recovery from the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic and its many impacts on health, families, jobs, education, housing, and much, much more. It's also important to note, though, that the city was facing several major crises even before COVID, and those have only been exacerbated. So it's an important time of choosing here in New York City, and we're pleased to bring you this series of interviews with candidates running for citywide offices, mayor, public advocate, controller, as well as interviews with candidates for other offices. And there will be debates down the line. These one-on-one conversations will help you to get to know the candidates better, learn about their resumes, their positions, their values, where they stand on key issues, and their vision for the future of the city. We hope this and other interviews will help you sort through your many choices and make informed decisions when it's time to vote. So today's interview, joining me now by Zoom, is Art Chang, a Democratic candidate for mayor of New York City. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ben, for having me here. I'm a huge admirer of your work and have been a big reader of your work in the Gotham Gazette and your work on Max and Murphy for many years. So thank you for everything you do.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So let's talk about your work. Before this mayoral run, give folks an overview of your resume, your background, the work you've done in your career before jumping into this race, and then we'll get into lots of specifics about what you want to do as mayor.
Sure. So I think if I were to ask my friends what the top three words are about me, they would say grit, creativity, and empathy to overcome obstacles in my life and learn to make the most of what I've been given, both the good and the bad, to successfully forge ahead. I've gravitated toward impossible problems that have typically been made more challenging by multiple stakeholders and constraints of budget, time, and regulations. As you know, I spent 30 years working in the public good, in the city and the state government, and social services, libraries, education, campaign finance, and voting. I have worked in the administrations of Dinkins, Giuliani, Governor Mario Cuomo, and Governor Pataki. I've been appointed by Mayors Bloomberg and de Blasio, and by city council speakers, Chris Quinn and Mark Viverito and Corey Johnson, as well as the Brooklyn Board President, Marty Markowitz. In parallel, I've had a 35-year career as an innovator in key industries, including government, construction, financial services, legal services, retail, fashion, publishing, and entertainment, fields that are very important to New York City. Technology has been a common thread. At Queens West, I learned how to build the city from the sewers to the street, to provide universal broadband, and to prepare our city for the climate crises to come. It was one of only two waterfront places in New York City that maintained electricity and power during Hurricane Sandy. From CUNY, the Brooklyn Public Library, and Brooklyn Tech, I learned how to create an education system to meet every student where they are, from LD to specialized high schools and beyond. From Safe Horizon and Case Commons, I learned to integrate and coordinate vital government services. I co-created the only web-based technology system for child welfare. As a co-creator of NYC Votes, I learned how to strengthen our city's democracy.
Is there somewhere you'd say for folks that you spent the bulk of your professional work?
There is no single place that I spent my time. I've been between the public and the private sectors. I've always had one foot on both sides.
Mhm.
While I've been working primarily in the public sector, I've worked on the private sector and vice versa. And I've always gone to where I saw a gap, where I saw things were either too complex and needed someone to address that problem, or where there was a need that could be filled. Just to make that, I think technology has probably been the single largest through line through my career.
And when it comes to technology or anything else, what is your expertise? I mean, what would you say to folks that you're most skilled at, that's something that does make you unique in these projects you've worked on?
I think that the thing is that my strength is in creating a vision that people can get around, and then finding the resources that are necessary to develop and support that vision, and then being able to convince stakeholders to get on board and to actually make this thing happen, whether it's funding or resources or talent.
And so you've decided to run for mayor. You haven't run for elected office before, have you?
No, this is my first time.
So explain that decision to jump into running for office and
Thanks.
running for the highest office in the city.
Yeah. Well, I feel like our city is standing at the edge of a precipice. We have interconnected problems. We have COVID, the eviction crisis, homelessness, and a significant lack of truly affordable housing. And it makes me want to have my hair on fire. I feel like my hair is on fire just as a citizen of New York City. And I don't feel like the folks who are running for office have the same kind of level of intensity. And I further ask, can we solve today's problems with the same thinking and the same people who were there when these problems were created? I think the city needs a very different perspective and experience. And I want to acknowledge, as a first-time candidate, I'm a dark horse candidate. I spent the last 35 years more focused on doing the work than talking about the work. But I believe that I have unique, proven experience solving problems that have touched nearly every aspect of our city.
So if voters say, that's an interesting resume, that's an interesting perspective, and appreciate your diverse resume and your experience and how you're talking about things, is okay, so what are the pillars of your mayoral campaign? And if you could say to a voter you only have a few seconds with, here's 2 or 3 big things that I want to do because the emergency that we're facing right now is at this scale that you just said, that people really aren't feeling urgent enough about. Here are the big ways that I want to change things. What would those be?
So my policies fall into 3 buckets that are, again, interconnected: jobs, families, and communities. We need to cut $10 billion in overhead and administrative costs across the board in the city budget so that we can redirect those to invest in direct services that actually help people. My key initiative is universal childcare, because we've seen the greatest loss of employment among women in recent history, and is actually potentially setting back the cause of women's advancement economically over the past couple of decades. We need to end the eviction crisis, and I believe I have a way to do that through a focus on mortgages. We also need to lead a digital transformation of City Hall, starting with data, leading to transparency and therefore accountability. We can do this to also inspire key New York City industries to transform, who actually didn't do that prior to COVID, which led them to be more vulnerable. And then finally, we have to really revitalize the city, starting with the arts and small business.
Cutting $10 billion from the city budget. Say more about that. That's a big number. Are you saying cut it, or you're saying repurpose it?
Repurpose it.
Okay.
Repurpose it. That under de Blasio, we came into office with less than a $70 billion budget. And today we have a $92 billion budget, just 8 years later. So over $20 billion in growth in budget expense. Now, a couple of really important things were done, and I'd say namely universal pre-K4 was a huge accomplishment, and that was worth the investment of money. But when I ask any average New Yorker, do you feel the impact of $20 billion of additional spend in our city? The answer is overwhelmingly, what? We actually did that. So we need to go back to a place where we're actually spending dollars directly on the front lines in ways that we can really, really help people. And when we do that, we can also think differently about some of the concerns about the dropping, real estate tax revenue, the income tax revenue, and think differently as well about how we think about reallocating that money from the police to housing and other things like that.
Where does the $10 billion live right now? I mean, do you have a sense of at least in broad strokes, where you think that kind of money is findable?
Yeah, so the mayor's office, I guess let's start with the mayor's office, which grew phenomenally in size over the past 8 years. Then we look at the headquarters, the administrations of really almost any agency. If you talk to any teacher or any principal in the DOE and ask them about the bureaucracy, at Central, which is what they call it, and they will all give you that same sigh of pain and frustration. We look at the NYPD, who has had a massive increase in the number of civilian personnel, even though the number of police officers has actually not really increased over the past 8 years. And you kind of go through agency after agency, and here's a clear example, right? DOH has a group set up to do pandemic response, but the mayor created a separate system in HHC. Why do we need two? Doesn't that lead to confusion and lead to really inefficiency in being able to deliver things like necessary COVID relief?
How much of the NYPD budget do you think needs to be reduced and spent elsewhere?
Well, I wrote a piece about this and it's on my website, chang.nyc. So I start with $1.3 billion based on a fundamental question. Does more policing equal more safety? When we look at the number of police officers we have compared to our population, we're in the top 4 in the country against far more violent cities. And then even given the increase in murders over the past year, when you look at the number of officers per murder, we are like a skyscraper, compared to other cities. So clearly there's a conversation to be had about what the right size is. We also need to think about the fact that, nationally 96% of calls to 911 do not require armed response. So do we actually need armed responders responding to every call? So I think we have an opportunity to really think differently about the police budget, aligning with the needs of the community. And we can say that on the one hand, we just lay out a case for maybe over policing, but I'll also lay out a case for under policing. That the spike in crime is coming because the police are not actually feet on the ground and present in the communities that are suffering the shootings and the murders.
When you think about a recovery from this economic crisis, you seem to get at one key pillar, which is free universal childcare. What else do you think city government needs to spearhead in order to help revive the New York City economy?
Well, the first thing we need to do, I think, is we have a moral imperative to do this, as well as an overall business strategic purpose, which is we have to preserve our communities. We have to end evictions. We have to keep people and small businesses in their places, preserve our community fabric, because that's what that's made of. And then only then can we think about how we regrow. The size of the eviction crisis, just for people who are not really thinking about it, 200,000 cases pending in housing court just for housing alone. That represents potentially the population of the city of Boston. And when you take that into account, plus the fact that we have 640,000 people living in NYCHA housing that was designed to hold about 440,000 people, that right there is the size of our low-income housing problem. And unless we have meaningful steps to address that, we're going to continue to see rising homelessness. We're going to see the inability to address things like homelessness caused by folks who are most vulnerable, like the mentally ill. And then that's going to be an inhibitor on getting our city to come back and to grow.
So what do we do? What do we do about, I mean, there's an eviction moratorium, or there's major rent relief for those who prove they need it. They've lost income, landlords who've lost the rental income as well, making those people all whole by, federal intervention, perhaps working with the state and the city. Are there other things that need to be done moving forward to address the city's housing problems? Let's stick with that topic.
Well,
Is there an Art Chang housing program?
there is. But before we get to housing, let's start with
Mhm.
this kind of stopping the evictions.
Mhm.
So
You mentioned a mortgage.
yeah, so
Post.
the tail wagging the dog is a vastly rigid mortgage system. And what I think we need to do is work very, very closely with banks and our partners in the financial services industries and figure out how we can get up to a 2-year extension on mortgages so that landlords can enjoy a period of payment-free period that then they can pass through to their tenants. If we can do this, and then this will not only keep people in their homes and reduce a huge amount of stress, but will also wipe out all the accrued debt that's been coming out through the moratorium, because nobody's talking about that, right? You got these 200,000 cases. We have over $1.2 billion in accrued debt for the people least able to afford it. So what are we going to do about that? If we get $1.2 billion of relief and we just put it into the system and it goes out to landlords and to mortgage holders, back into mortgage holders, is that actually relief? So I think we need to create a system that is actually giving people a real break. And then on housing, the city has been very unfocused in thinking about its inventory of housing. Both Stringer and Sean Donovan have talking about kind of a land bank proposal. Those are all very kind of good ideas because land is obviously one of the biggest cost inputs to creating this housing. But how are you going to get more land into the system? We can think more creatively about air rights, about parking lots, about underutilized things like highway on-ramps, about golf courses, and think holistically about how we repurpose the available land that we have. The city also has large numbers of properties that are in delinquency and therefore are delinquent on their property taxes. So the city can use its first lien position to both keep people in their homes, but also to figure out how to replenish and augment the store of land that it has available for redevelopment.
What about land that's already developed on but could hold a lot more development? What do you think about sort of changing zoning? Would you do that? Would you look to upzone parts of the city? Are there areas that you think are ripe for upzonings? What's your philosophy on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because, over the past 20 years, the city's population has grown by over a million people, but it's been done in this kind of sporadic, non-cohesive, non-holistic fashion. So when people ask, for instance, we have these issues and claims of NIMBYism around, increasing density in especially affluent areas. I ask, well, have you ever seen a comprehensive plan for increasing low-income housing across the city? Everybody wants it, but why can't we actually say, here are the places that we think it can go? That here is a rollout plan that we'd like to propose. And then you can start having conversations around with the people in the city to say, this actually makes sense. Are we all on board with this idea that we're going to create this? And then what is your particular contribution to this effort?
Do you have any of that ready for us? Or are you working on that? Or what's the plan on identifying those areas?
Oh, I don't have that. That is a work in process.
Mm-hmm. So you've done this work with the NYC Votes program, the offshoot of the City Campaign Finance Board that's tasked with increasing voter participation. So I wanted to take this chance to ask you, now that you're running for office, what's your assessment of why voter participation in New York City is so low? And is there anything you can do now as a candidate to expand the electorate? Is that part of your strategy here? As you called yourself a dark horse earlier, you got into the race a little late. You haven't been elected before. Talk a little bit about what is your sense after your time doing this work of why participation is so low and what can be done about it?
I think the city has a lot of issues in communications generally. And I think that the Campaign Finance Board has been doing a mighty job trying to publicize things like ranked choice voting, for example. But the fact that we now have this shift of people, right, we now have a mix of kind of traditional media outlets for consuming information. We have social, And the social continues to fragment in very, very interesting ways. Like the social that I think of, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, my sons won't touch them, right? So we're dealing with a set of people who are all living in different platforms, but the city hasn't actually adapted its communication strategy to all of those different platforms. And at the same time, we still have older folks who are really not on the internet. We have folks who do not have great internet access, who need to get information in different ways. So the city as a whole needs to rise to this challenge of communication. And one of the things that I observed from all the protests and the marches, and the fact that they were leaderless, in that they were leaderful, small groups of people spontaneously coming out, is that that's really a reflection of much more of the P2P type of communication world that we're in. So if we want people to come out and vote, we need to actually give them a reason to do that. And the candidates have a significant role in that. And so what I'm doing is I'm just trying to put policies out there or in a way that I think treats voters with it, that assuming that they have intelligence and they care and they want to know what the issues are, and explaining them with enough detail and precision that they actually can learn something in that process.
What are you trying to do? Who are you trying to reach in this campaign to draw people out who haven't been participating before? Are there certain, sort of large groups of people that you think, they should really be participating in municipal elections, and we just need to reach them in this campaign to get them out? Do you have a sense of what kind of demographic groups those are?
Well, we can start with Ray McGuire and Andrew Yang, who haven't voted in a municipal election in over a decade. In Andrew's case, over 2 decades. The lack of voting is a very widespread phenomenon. There are communities who are well known to be underrepresented in their turnout, and I would include that the Asian community. We have these immigrant communities that are a very substantial part of our city fabric, who are struggling, who have language issues, who also are very divided among them, very fragmented. And so we have an issue reaching those folks and helping them understand, how their vote actually matters. But on the other hand, we're seeing some real signs of hope. Like we're seeing, I think, a record number of Asian candidates for office this year. I'm super excited about that. It means that we're seeing a transition, in this very low voting community or lower voting community that I think is going to looks good for the future.
Shifting topics, you brought up NYCHA earlier. Are there a couple pillars of a NYCHA recovery plan that you would offer? NYCHA doesn't necessarily lack for plans. It really lacks for action and funding, and of course, better management as well. But do you know what policies you would put forward as a candidate and then as a mayor to try to rescue NYCHA and ensure that NYCHA can get to a state of good repair?
You make a great point about the limitations right now. I mean, over $41 billion in accrued maintenance costs, very, very difficult to tack. There's a very worthwhile experiment going on with RAD. There are issues with it on either side, but even if it were to be phenomenally successful, it would probably address only about 15% of the units in NYCHA housing. And so what do you do with that? So one of the things that I would say is that we need to build truly low income housing throughout the city. NYCHA residents should actually be given the first crack at that for having endured the conditions that they experience right now. And if we can build housing in a way and in a place and with the surrounding amenities and supports in the community that actually can attract NYCHA residents and convince them to move, and then we'll actually have a much more efficient way to go in and gut renovate those buildings. And by the way, we have a Green New Deal. We have to actually retrofit those buildings for the carbon-free future. And I think that's going to be not only a great way to address low-income housing needs, but also a huge economic spur to the city.
Is there a way that you would rethink education in the city? This is obviously one of the most important jobs for a mayor. There's mayoral control of city schools. Let me know, of course, if you're opposed to mayoral control of city schools. But either way, the mayor would have significant input into education policy. Are there things that you think need to radically change in order to get better results in our school system, have all kids educated, have all opportunity for students throughout the city. Are there key ways you're thinking about reinventing city education policy?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can start with short-term, medium-term, and long-term. But let's say at the facts right now. Pre-COVID, there were 1.1 million students, probably around 960,000 right now. That's going to cause a tremendous financial hit to the DOE's budget. We have about 30,000 homeless students. We have about over 10,000 students in juvenile detention, and about 28% of our student body has an IEP. That is, they're in special ed. So even in a best case situation, we have enormous challenges in educating our students. And now with COVID, the lack of broadband, lack of internet connected devices, the difficulty of conveying teaching across the internet to students is very, very, very difficult. So we do need to think about a wholesale change to a system that hasn't fundamentally changed in 100 years, where the schedule and everything else was based on an agrarian past. And we're actually thinking about this as a kind of a mass production of students for something. Like, what do we ask? Like, what's the purpose of education? What's the value of the certificate you get at the end of high school? So my plan is pretty basic. I mean, number one, we got to start with early childhood, because with universal childcare, we can level the playing field across the board. We can have a much better shot at actually giving students the nutritional, the care, the health care, and other things that they need to be able to support brain development, socioeconomic development, socio-emotional development, and educational development to set them up to be able to succeed once they get to school. It's also a place to be able to help families, because without actually dealing with families, and then we actually have lost the key partner in our educational system. In high school to college, we also have to think about, how do we address a situation where students actually develop in different ways? They experience different things as they go through school. They may end up in high school at very different places. And I ask the question, why can't we meet every student where they are? Why can't we provide a way to give individualized instructions and curriculum to students that reflect their strengths and the areas where they need to strengthen? And we can have a much more seamless interaction and fluid interaction with college, and especially CUNY, because we have this great resource right here. So in my vision, I imagine that students are able to go to high school. They start taking college courses when they're ready. There's a seamless transition into college that's coupled with workforce development, paid internships, and the ability to kind of learn and figure out what they want to do. But that actually learning never ends, because we're facing a changing world. We know the future of education, the future of work is vastly changing. So why don't we have lifelong education?
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Art Chang is a Democratic candidate for New York City Mayor. Appreciate the time. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Ben. And for all the viewers, I welcome you to come to my website, chang.nyc, and you can sign up right there for a Zoom open office hours.
Thank you. And thank you for watching Decision NYC with Ben Max. Key decisions for New York City voters are coming in June and the fall. There's a lot on the line for all of us in the future of New York City. I hope this conversation and others are helpful to you. I'm Ben Max. See you next time.